Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Pen Testing Routers, Learn Routersploit framework. And we're going to be looking at, are your routers hacked? And this is going to be an unbelievably informative session because so many people currently are working from home. We got to really make sure we understand how to secure our own internet gateway. So the router, remember, is the core of your internet connection, right? So it's your gateway to the internet. The router device, that is. And we're going to be taking a quick journey into learning how to actually test the security of our routers, whether it be in your corporate environment or whether it be at your home network because you're working from home. It's a router or a router, depending on if you're from Europe or USA. We're going to just be using the term router synonymously. So for those of you that are from Europe, routers means routers. So let's take a look at what we're going to discover this session. We're going to give you a quick update with the cyber news. So we'll give you the latest and greatest of currently what's happening with regards to cybersecurity and specifically internet connection, routers, modems, VPNs. We'll be looking at how to get up and running with Routersploit, so how to install it in our Linux favorite flavor. And we'll be looking at MITRE, attack knowledge base, so we can discover new types of threat tactics, techniques, methods that the malicious folks are using, and we can always try and keep ourselves up to date with threat intelligence. And then finally, we're going to be going through a couple of different exploit demonstrations using the Routersploit framework. So without further ado, let's jump into some cyber news. This is a pretty interesting Forbes.com So you can see the title there, Apple jailbreak iOS 11 to 13.5. That's not this exact story yet, but it's coming next. So this is a multi-millionaire surveillance dealer steps out of the shadows and his $9 million WhatsApp hacking ban. I would encourage you to go and read this article because this will give you an understanding as to where we're at. So this was an article that broke in 2019 in August, and this will give you some insight as to what potential technologies are out there to intercept our communications. So whether it be using a mobile device, a cell phone, a tablet, or in our case, a network where we've got wired connections, we need to be aware of the cybersecurity risks when using different types of communication programs, protocols, and we're about to take a step into the next bit of news, and that's the actual iOS jailbreaking. This is the latest Uncover, the most advanced jailbreak tool. It's just been released a few days ago. And you can see, so was the latest version of Apple iPhone, just updated a few days ago as well to 13.5. So this tool actually supports iOS 13.5. You can install it for Apple Mac, Windows, and Linux as well, and also an iOS installation guide, as you can see. So giving you a lot of compatibility in iOS 11 through to 13.5. And you can go and obviously read more about it on the website you see in the link. Next up is the FBI warning us about fraudsters' paradise, up to 130,000 hacked ASUS or ASUS routers for sale for a few dollars. And what that means is a lot of those devices have been exploited, attacked, sometimes even a hardware modification to them. And of course, these folks are selling access to those devices that predominantly are running within the United States. Some of the latest updates that we can see from April 2020, hackers are exploiting a Sophos firewall 0-day. Again, these are things where we start realizing, especially with a lot more people working from home, everybody tends to be targeting some of those network devices that a lot of folks are actually running at home. So this was an emergency patch that actually had to fix the SQL injection bug that's been exploited in the wild, and that was impacting its XG firewall product. Read more about that. Another vulnerability released in March 2020, uncovering OpenWRT remote code execution. So this is, again, crucial because you're going to see one of the demonstrations I'm going to be covering will show you how to actually extract your router firmware, and then we'll be looking at how you can go along and rebuild the router firmware. Sometimes you might get a standard router firmware and you want to go along and reverse engineer it to find out exactly what may be within your firmware. You're going to see how we do that coming up later, and specifically we'll be looking at a device that actually uses OpenWRT firmware, pretty much modified, but it is all open source, even allowing you to use a JTAG connection onto the actual router board. Next article is from the Register. Leave your admin interface TLS, your Transport Layer Security Cert, and private key in your router firmware in 2020. Just Netgear things, so finding spots. This is obviously how to secure a local gateway's web control panel, and Netgear left in its router firmware key ingredients needed to intercept and tamper with secure connections to its equipment web-based admin interfaces. So another very interesting article that was from 2020. Then we can see another article there for Netgear this time. Thousands of Netgear routers are at risk of getting hacked. What to do? And this was a March 2020 article. Make sure you go along and read all about it. This was including some of the very expensive high-end Netgear devices as well. So you can see nearly 50 Netgear models need firmware patches ASAP. And you'll see a lot of the vendors are releasing the actual updates, the firmwares, very quickly because of the severe vulnerabilities. Tom's Guide news, looking at hundreds of millions of cable modems could be hacked due to cable horn floor. This was an article that broke in January 2020. So make sure you go along again and read some of those details, because it is your modem effectively, but a lot of times your modem is your router, or your modem is also your Wi-Fi access point. Looking at the article from the approvedmodems.com, specifically compare the ARIS surfboard cable modems. Easily sort through the list of ARIS surfboard cable modems and Wi-Fi cable modems, so it's a cable modem router combos. And the list of the ARIS cable modems is forever growing. So it's confusing which is the best for your service providers and service tier. And of course, you can see some of the older models. So on top of that, some models were built with the Puma 6 chipset and still remain broken and pose security risks. So do read more about some of those risks on some of your actual ARIS devices. So there you can see a lot of news articles surrounding home devices, routers, modems, gateways, so multiple function devices. And there's the deeper insight into that cable horn we just mentioned from the nakedsecurity.sophos.com blog. So definitely again, go and read a different perspective on that. And this is really just showing us a cybersecurity 10-year history of hacking routers. So kind of what was going on in 2011, where we can see there was massive DNS poisoning attacks in Brazil. Then we saw 2012, there were 4.5 million routers being hacked in Brazil. 2015, we saw how hackers exploit router flaws in unusual farming attack. That was again in Brazil. And then 100,000 home routers recruited to spread Brazilian hacking scam. So there was a lot of specific attack vectors that broke because of certain leaks, as we've seen over the last couple of years. And then 2019, we saw a lot of the router CSRF attacks and DNS hijacking in Brazil. Again, you're going to see this is just a slight, look back in time to see that the routers has always been a huge, big target, especially with some of those leaks coming from the US WikiLeaks and so forth. That's something we need to be very concerned about, and very sure we are rebooting our routers and we are testing our router security pretty regularly. So let's jump into a little bit more detail as to what we're going to cover with the Routersploit. So remember, your router is going to be your core gateway to the internet in a lot of companies, in a lot of home work offices, especially since a lot more of us have been forced to work from home lately. And of course, the problem, most people don't spend much time securing or checking their router. So let alone rebooting it weekly, which is a very important tip. Get used to rebooting those devices just in case it was hacked a week ago and you might have automatic updates for your router firmware as an example, different models. So hopefully you get, the firmware update. But as a security precaution, reboot your routers weekly. You can either just set it up on an auto timer, plug where your router is going to be rebooted automatically once a week. It might be an old-fashioned way of doing that, but at least you don't have to do the manual reboot your router weekly. Then you can automate it. Okay, don't have too many home automation devices because those devices could also be hacked. Typically, because a lot of those devices may have old firmware or set up with default passwords or other security issues that haven't been hardened. So a lot of devices come with weakened security without all the bells and whistles enabled, meaning all the features, the security features are typically not enabled. So exploiting home computers inside those router networks or exploiting company networks inside those router networks, of course, is huge and very, very popular all the time. We've seen a lot more in the dark web marketplaces, seen a lot more about different types of attack vectors being launched. British Airways and some of the other airlines in the last couple of weeks have been big targets. A couple of million records of breached there for British Airways and EasyJet. So we've seen a lot of the attack vectors, amping up, especially when you start looking at the network side of things. So we want to look for, scanning routers for certain vendors or certain vendor vulnerabilities and weaknesses. And we're going to be looking at how Routersploit is going to allow us to get the password in plain text in some modules, some attack vectors. Other attack vectors you're going to see we're only going to be able to get access to the MD5 hash. So we'll be able to go and crack the hash by using a lot of online hash cracking services. Some of them are paid services, some of them are free. We'll look at being able to execute commands in that remote router, directory path traversal, to download files, authenticate without any password, change the password, and of course change a lot of other router settings. So there's a lot of things we can do with some of these new interactive frameworks. And when we look at the actual components of Routersploit, if you've been doing a lot of pen testing, you're going to feel right at home when we look at the fact that Routersploit is an interactive framework, very similar to Metasploit, very similar to a lot of the new tools that are coming out in this interactive frame-like fashion. Another great tool will be Recon NG, showing how we can use very complex tools all integrated into a seamless framework. So Routersploit components consist of various modules that will help pen testers do the assessments, such as exploits, those modules that take advantage of identified known vulnerabilities, creds, modules designed to test credentials against network services, scanners, modules that check if the target is vulnerable to any exploit, payloads will be the modules for generating payloads for various architectures and injection points, such as the action you want to take once you've actually got remote code executed access on a target point. And then generic modules that perform generic attack vectors, such as generic web portals where you've got to try and guess the password. We're going to be able to do things like automated dictionary attack, brute force, so forth. Now, when it comes to installing Routersploit, it's pretty straightforward in Debian. So if you're using Debian Linux, straight out the box, run your commands you see on the screen, do your git cloning. Once you've cloned the GitHub repository for Routersploit, change into the Routersploit directory, then do your Python 3. You want to basically install all of the Python requirements by reading that requirements.txt file, and then lastly run your /rsf.py. It's a Python program effectively, and we'll be showing you that in a few minutes. We'll get into doing some of the demos, showing you what to expect when you are presented with pen testing routers, what's the core requirements after you've done your port scanning, enumeration, once you've located the device, etc., etc. we'll be looking at even you're adding Bluetooth low energy support. So if you want to install those components, again, make sure you run those two commands. It's a couple of other additional Python modules. So there you can see there's a blue Pi, and they're going to be using pip to do a lot of those installations with those text files, because pip is your Python install packager. So those pip commands, those are basically using Python install packager to install additional components for the use of Routersploit, and that's installing it for Debian Linux. Looking at the installing Routersploit for Ubuntu Mint Linux, pretty much similar steps there, no big difference there. And generally, when you want to run it through Ubuntu Debian, just to be on the safe side, you're going to run the Python 3, tell it that you want to use Python 3 to run that actual Python file, which will then bring up the framework that you're about to see a few demos on. Once again, the Bluetooth low energy support can be also installed following the same procedures you did for Debian. So let's go into the first demonstration. And the first demo, we're going to be looking at doing an automatic test for all vulnerabilities when you are connected to your own, let's say, home router. We're going to look at some of the common IP addresses that those routers will use. So Routersploit has kind of automation built into it, to some extent. It can check one router for all vulnerabilities and weaknesses, which is the module we're about to use. It's called Auto Pwn, and that's going to scan for all vulnerabilities and weaknesses using one module. Now, if you're American, you would have laughed at my pronunciation there, but hey, at least you know that I'm a half-breed. I've grown up in different countries, and my accent's a little bit weird, right? So, as a test router, you're going to see I'm going to be doing some tests on a Cisco router, which is going to be on 192.168.1.1, and a lot of admin consoles are going to be running on port 80. So the first thing we'll look at doing is starting the Routersploit framework. And once we start the framework, we're then going to go along and use some of those commands. So use scanners, auto home, that's the specific module. So that will be how we load the module. Once you've loaded the module, we're going to be able to view some of the optional attributes that need to be set in a lot of the attacks. So as an example, you need to set the target IP address. So you need to use the show options to show the attributes that are required to be set. Then if there's any attributes that need to be set, go along and set the target as an example, set the port to port 80 if that needs to be set, and then when you finish setting those attributes, finally use the run command. So that's one of the demos I'm about to drop into, and we'll be taking a quick look at the MITRE attack to give you a little bit more insight into some of these demos, because you're going to see one of the actual attack techniques we're looking at was from one of those APT, those Advanced Persistent Threat Group actors. And this is amazing threat intel, and we want to go along and look at what's happening of late. So let's go to the attack.mitre.org website. Got to be lucky that we make typos, that Google just solves all those problems for us. And then we can see MITRE attack is a globally accessible knowledge base of adversary tactics and techniques based on real-world observations. The attack knowledge base is used as a foundation for the development of specific threat models and methodologies in the private sector, in government, and in the cybersecurity product and service community. So this is showing us all of the different tactics: initial access, execution, persistence, privilege escalation, defense, evasion, credential access, discovery, lateral movement, collection, command and control, exfiltration, impact. And if we go down to the matrices and then we're going to launch the attack navigator. And then we can see this is a layered approach. So we're looking at the initial access, execution, persistence, privilege escalation. Now on the top there, if I wanted to go along and say, okay, I'm going to go and add the multi-select control, and let's say I'm targeting APT group 28. And I want to click on the view button. So here we can see the APT 28 is a threat group that has been attributed to the Russia's main intelligence directorate of the Russia General Staff by July 2018. The US Department of Justice indictment, basically that group reportedly compromised the Hillary Clinton campaign, and you can read all about that. What we're looking at is associated group description. So we're looking at the threat intel here. We're looking at some of their aliases that they were using. So Pawn Storm, Fancy Bear, Swallowtail, Group 74, and there we can see SEDNIT. This designation has been used in reporting both to refer to the threat group and its associated malware, and the techniques that they actually have been using. So there we can actually see the bind a domain name, obtain and reuse payloads, access token manipulation, application access tokens, automated collection, bootkit, command line interface, commonly used ports, communication through removable media, proxying, credential dumping. So this is just giving you some examples of how we can try and understand the different types of tactics that different types of advanced persistent threat groups have been using. And that's because sometimes leaks and weaknesses that were out could have actually been weapons that some of those state-sponsored hackers have been using. And of course, we need to be aware of the intelligence information so we are protected, or at least our systems are going to be protected against those attacks. So let's go into the very first demo that I was mentioning. Let's go and take a look at actually doing this. I'm going to be using a different Linux machine. You're going to see why using virtualization is not always the best method depending on your environment. I always tell people to set up a dedicated Linux machine, whether it be using a Raspberry Pi or an older laptop or desktop, whatever the case may be. Try and use a physical machine when it comes to testing of the network, especially with some of the newer commercial products that actually use a lot of new security tie-ins. So they actually pretty much tie you in to security. As you look at like Windows as an example, when you're running VMware or VirtualBox, a lot of your Windows security will be tied into all of your virtual environments as well. So this demo we're about to look at is basically automatically testing for all vulnerabilities. And you can see the commands we're about to run. I'm going to switch over to the other Linux machine I'm going to be using. And I've already gone and installed Routersploit and some of the other tools that I wanted to demonstrate for you folks today. So the first thing I start off with is doing a simple Nmap scan. As you can see with my Nmap scan, I did a service version scan, just looking specifically at what the default ports are open. And you can see on this specific device, this is a Linksys E4200 device. It's a Linksys Cisco E4200, and it's a router, wireless access point, and a pretty decent little device. Had 2.4 gig and 5 gig, so it actually supported both the 2.4 and 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi frequencies. Anyhow, so then we just went off and we did our basic Nmap scanning, and in my custom network folder with some of my pen testing tools, I always tell people, start off with building your own hacking machine. Don't use all of these distributions that have got hundreds and hundreds of packages, because they may not always work very reliably. So I'm going to go ahead and change to my Routersploit directory, and there we just ran the Python 3 and the /. Now, if you're not sure what the actual script is, you can see it's just a Python file. So we're going to run the Python 3 /, and you can see we now at the Routersploit interactive prompt. So currently this is version 3.4.1, code name, I knew you were trouble, and 132 scanners, 4 creds, 171 generic modules, 4 payloads, 32 encoders, and 6 something was the last number there. I'm not sure what that exactly meant there. But anyway, one of the first commands we could run is show all to look at all the modules that you actually have available in the Routersploit framework. So you can see there's a lot of different modules and different tools, testing cameras, testing the web interfaces, testing Telnet, SSH. There's a lot of different modules built into Routersploit, including a lot of the micro-tick testing. And that's pretty crucial because you would have seen a lot of micro-tick vulnerabilities that was used by some of those state-sponsored hackers. So let's say we're now going to go along and we're going to use the use scanner. And if we just tab, as you can see, I'm just typing the first 3 letters, and then I tab so you know you're at the right hierarchical point. Scanners, and we want to use the auto pwn. So use scanner / auto pwn, and we can then use the show info command. And you can see this scans for all vulnerabilities and weaknesses against multiple devices. And then I can say show options. And there we can see there's not too many options that I would need to set here. The ones that are already set in the bottom section there, of course, we can just leave it as default for now, because we wanted to test any vendor. We want to basically use as much flexibility as we can in these options. So all we want to do is say set the target, and in my case, the target is on my local network. And once I've set the target, I'm going to use the run command. Now, before you just run the run command, you can go in and run help. And of course, help will give you some of the core global commands. And when you're in a specific module, you've got sometimes variable different types of commands. So here we can see I've got the ability to go ahead and do run, or check, which is check if a given target is vulnerable to selected modules exploit. Well, I want to go do an auto scan effectively, automatically test all vulnerabilities. So I'm going to just go say run, and hopefully you can see how quick that was. It already came back at the top there and actually recognized a vulnerability on that Linksys Cisco device. So we need to let it finish doing the actual scan. Now you would have actually seen from the second demonstration that we have planned. It's not complicated. I'm just going to walk you through that though, because of course you'll be able to go along, instead of saying use scanners auto pwn, you could go along and say use scanners d-link as an example, and then you go along and select the specific show options, so you know what attributes to go and set, and then set any of those attributes that need to, and then go ahead and run that. So you can see the actual different tests that this default auto pwn module went through, and quite clearly it came back telling me that that router is vulnerable to this exploit. So I'm now going to copy over that exploit. I'm going to copy that full path so I can go along and load that exploit. So next piece will be to launch the actual exploit now. So we go along and say use we just pasted that, and then show info. So this gives you a lot of details. There's not just one physical device that it supports. It actually supports multiple devices, as you can see, and a lot of specific references where you can go and read up more on the technical in-depth details about the actual attack vector we're about to launch, and specifically the links there are about the actual weaknesses, about the attack vectors, effects, and all of the technical details you'd need to know. So at this point, we could go along now and run the show options command. So you can see the options we're going to go ahead and select is going to typically just be the target. So we're going to go ahead and say set target. In my case, 192.168.1.1. It's already got the port set to 80. And with a bit of luck, if I now go along and choose to run that, you can see I've got through the first piece now where it's pretty much saying running module target is vulnerable, invoking a command loop. It is blind command injection, response is not available. So welcome to CMD, commands are sent to the target via the execute method. And you can of course read further exploitation, use the show payloads. So now we could go along and say, well, what can we do? What actions can we now do to that actual router? We've got initial remote code executed access. So we want to see what we could do now. So show us the additional payloads that we can use. Aha, and so here it's telling us that we can use either the bind or reverse TCP bind. So basically, we're going to go along and we're going to run the reverse TCP, because this is going to give us much more flexibility, as you'll see. So we're going to go along and select that payload. So we'll just copy that, either Control-Shift-C or right-click with your mouse and copy it manually. So, of course, whichever method you choose. And we're now going to go along and say set payload. And then show options. And we need to go along and set our own local host address. And once we set our local host, we should be able to go ahead and say run. Job done. So now you can see we've actually elevated this to an interactive shell, and you can see it's not telling us much, but if we go along and say if config, we actually remotely executing code on that router right now. So if config, you can see that these are all the network interfaces of that actual device. I can also go along and say pwd, print my working directory. And I could then go along and look for. Now we can see sometimes when you launching these attack vectors, there might be a connection error because you're taking, like, you know, hypothetically speaking, you're taking a baseball bat and you try to break into that system. It's not always going to be keeping that system running reliably once you've gone in and you've beaten that box with a baseball bat, so to say. So we want to go along and let's say we want to cat out. We want to go and tell it to show us the contents of the etc/passwd, because we want to go and look for the admin password, obviously in hash format, and there you have it. So now we have the MD5 hash of the router admin. At least we can tell the admin name there is admin, and I could then go ahead and crack that with either Hashcat or some of the online hash cracking utilities that are freely available. Some of the good ones out there would be hashkiller.io, MD5 decryptor. There's hundreds of them out there. Just go and do a quick Google, and this is simple demonstration showing you how we're able to scan for a vulnerability on, in my case, this router, which was a Cisco Linksys E4200, and was able to find the vulnerability, I was able to use a module first to gain remote code executed access, and then I was able to gain remote admin RCE, where I could then literally go along and dump the MD5 hash by traversing to the actual etc passwd file and just catching that out on the screen. So of course at this point, if you go and crack the password, job done, you can open up a web console and you can then modify and do whatever else you need to do. So at this point, we want to go ahead and really realize that it's crucial for us to understand that our routers are normally connected to your service provider and normally could be directly accessible to the internet depending on the security your service provider is using. So you need to always ensure that you check your router security. It's your device, even though a lot of times you might be renting it from your service provider. I always recommend that folks should always go along and set up their own device to isolate and segment their own network. So if you've got a whatever router from your internet provider, you're going to go along and buy another router and set up another isolated network segment. So you can then run your own devices in its own isolated network segment where you can then harden security, effectively creating almost like a demilitarized zone where you could then create multiple subnets, and you can maybe put the guests on the one subnet and then yourself on another subnet and family on other subnets, but isolation is crucial. So I'm going to Control C, exit that session, and I'm going to exit out of Routersploit. And for this next little demo, I've already gone ahead and installed Firmware Mod Toolkit, which, as I'll show you in a second, we're going to just go through some basic demos of if you downloaded the new firmware. So you go to your netgear.com or your whoever the vendor is of that device, and you download the firmware. The firmware that I'm going to be showing you is already downloaded. I downloaded it for some of the GL Net devices. They're becoming pretty popular, and you can see I already did some basic tests earlier on, but here's the firmware, the binary firmware that I'm going to be showing you how to reverse engineer. That way you're going to always be able to test what's in your device, and then also how you could go along and reprogram that. So we'll be showing you how you could use the extract script to actually extract the firmware, and you can then also go along and run the build firmware. It's just a bash script that will go ahead and build that new firmware for you to then flash onto that device. So if a malicious criminal went to basically go along and reverse engineer somebody's firmware, they could then go along and modify some of the parameters and then go along and rebuild that firmware with obviously some kind of a backdoor. So this is showing you the process of how good or bad people do it both ways. So you understand how they could go along, reverse engineer your firmware, recreate it with a backdoor, and of course you can do the same thing by going to reverse engineer your own firmware to see what's in your firmware. Your binary firmware is pretty much your operating system for the router, the network device that we're speaking about. So some of the very basic commands that would normally be running through, not really rocket science. You'll see these are standard, Linux commands that are built into a lot of Linux versions. So if I go ahead and just run the file command, now you can go along and look at the manual for file, what it can normally do, just to show you if you haven't done this many times before. And file tests each argument in an attempt to classify it. So we'll quit that, and we're going to just run the file command against that OpenWRT and that MT300N binary file. And just by using the file command, you can see it's actually told us a lot of details about the binary firmware. It's giving us that it's actually using U-boot, booting process, MIPS, OpenWRT, or Linux kernel 14.14.63, and that's your OS kernel image, LZMA or compression, and that's quite a lot of details. That's without going along and using hex editing tools like XXD. So we could go ahead and use XXD against that. It's not always going to be so nice to view that. So we could also then use strings to start looking for identifying human readable components. This is helping us investigate the fact that, oh, it's a Linux system, it's using MIPS and it's OpenWRT. So we've already found out a lot of details just simply by running through some standard command line utilities. So if I would look at using file, strings, XXD, a hex editor, and then we can even go along and use something like a binary walk, which is a third-party tool. And if you do man binary walk, you can see it's a tool for searching binary images for embedded files and executable code. Binary walk minus E. If you want to see the syntaxes, just use the -- help. And there you can see the different commands. Okay, so we're going to be basically doing the -E extract, automatically extract known file types. So there we can see how it's pretty much extracted the same types of data we were able to extract before, but this is giving us some more crucial details, such as the actual created date. So this was 2018-08-16. So we've been able to get a little bit more details there again, looking at using some of those other third-party tools. So that was binary walk. And then the other tool that I want to finish off showing you is going to be this automated firmware mod kit I was showing you. So to install the firmware mod kit, go and have a look at searching for the GitHub. So if you just do firmware mod kit GitHub and follow those step-by-step instructions to do the install of the dependencies, and then you'll see all of the different bash scripts that are already available for you. So whenever running a lot of these tools, that of course I'm doing somewhat automated reverse engineering whereby I don't have to go and do it all manually. So make sure when this is the case that you're using certain automated scripts, that you always go along and look at what are those scripts actually going to be doing. So let's say I want to go and look at the extract firmware script. I'm going to go and look at the fact that it's a bash script compared to Routersploit being Python. And so we can see there's a lot of specific things this is going to be running through, different sequences, different commands. There you can see it's actually going to be using binary walk there as well. So this is a script that's going to be combining a lot of the different individual tools I was showing you, or command line tools I was using a few minutes ago. And of course, this will run through many of them. So we won't wait for that to finish. That was just showing an example as to why it's important to always check the actual script you're going to be running through. And so the last piece there will just be to run the extract firmware. And we just specify that OpenWRT. This is an MT. And this is actually pretty cheap, like 20 or 30 euro or dollar router. And what I really like about these little boxes is they're great for travel companions. You'll be able to literally flash it with your own custom modded firmware or some of the standard ones they have, specifically allowing you to set up hardware VPNs inside your actual router. So don't just trust your software VPN. Also look at setting up a hardware VPN where you're going to have multiple kill switches enabled. So this will go along, and we can see that one was already extracted. Let's see if it's extracted the other AR. That already exists. So we can just go ahead and say RM. So we want to remove that. And we'll say remove that recursively. Okay, so you would have seen that pretty much extracted. I'm not going to try and re-delete some of those other files that's already downloaded because we ran out of time for this demonstration already, but you would have seen that actually run because it did have those files, and I think it's telling me that the reason why it's not actually deleting that is because there's the other main directory there, which is the FMK. So let's try that last time, and we'll try and run that again. There we go. So as you can see, it's still running. This is going to take a little bit of time because there is a lot of, wow, well, there's already some of the parts that were already successfully extracted. So now you can go along and start looking at the different components that did actually extract. And as you can see, because I've ran this before, there were some components that were already there. So it took a lot quicker than what it would do on the first run, as you folks I'm sure will see, because this is something I'm sure you folks are going to want to go and check yourself. Alrighty, so that's some of the hands-on demos. We're going to just flip back to my presentation. Okay, so there you can see I went through that practical demo too, where I looked at talking about, I spoke about how you can go along and use scanners and specifically select your different vendor. As an example, that will show you D-Link. So we did a couple of demos with Routersploit framework. And then we showed you some of the other options, which you can go along and select different payloads. And of course, you can go along and read more about the other techniques that you can use with Routersploit. If you go and look at the GitHub for Routersploit, and they have a wiki section there, they've got quite a lot of different details about the different types of techniques that you can actually use to test your security of your routers. So I just wanted to quickly summarize. We start off the session with some of the updated cybersecurity news, specifically about different types of devices that are currently being hacked. I also brought to you the latest information about the iPhone iOS that was just updated a few days ago. There is already, for a very long time, there hasn't been any jailbreak tools available. And of course, this has recently been released to the world. And that means all of you folks with Apple devices need to ensure you're running VPNs and you make sure what you download and run on them, because there are vulnerabilities. Never leave your device alone where anybody can actually plug it in or do anything with it. We showed you how to get Routersploit up and running. We showed you what it could do, how it works, how we installed it, and they gave you a quick demonstration of the MITRE ATT&CK knowledge threat intel base that can be very, very useful in trying to understand the actual threat landscape and who are some of the advanced persistent threat actors. And we finally finished off doing some demos with Routersploit, and I showed you the firmware mod kit extracting a firmware where you could then go along and build the firmware after running the extract script. So hopefully you all enjoyed it. It was a great session for me, folks, and I really appreciate you spending the time to come and watch and listen to our presentation. We're going to hand this over to the Q&A session for you folks to ask all the questions you may have.